We're indeed honored to have Stephen Kinzer as our second speaker. Mr. Kinzer is one of my personal heroes in life. He's a former New York Times correspondent, traveled all over the world for the Times, and currently he's visiting fellow at the Washington Institute at Brown University. But most important about Mr. Kinzer is the phenomenal books he has written. And if you read all of his books, some of which are very small, very readable, I will guarantee you will know more about foreign policy, especially from a libertarian perspective. And I doubt if he calls himself a libertarian, but his stuff, you will be more of an expert on foreign policy than most people in the United States. And I'm referring to books like Bitter Fruit, which is the history of the CIA's intervention in Guatemala, where they ousted the democratically elected president of the country and installed a succession of brutal dictators. All the Shah's Men, which talks about the regime change operation in Iran in 1953, where they ousted the democratically elected or appointed prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. And he's got a great overview of regime change operations in a book called Overthrow. And like I say, these are infinitely readable books. I mean, very accessible for the regular person. And then his great book, his newest book, is The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. I couldn't put the book down. I mean, it's much bigger than the other books, but I couldn't put it down. It is such a phenomenal book. I mean, you get a really good survey of what happened to America, this turn that America took during the Cold War. I should announce that Stephen's going to be available at our booth after his talk to sign books. The Brothers, we don't have the other books, but they're available on Amazon. I highly advise buying The Brothers. It is a phenomenal book, and I highly recommend it. It's been reviewed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other big publications, and favorably reviewed, shockingly enough. We have one of these reviews on from the Washington Post that we got permission to pass out to people here. That's on your chairs. And so without any further ado, Stephen Kinzer.
Thank you, Jacob. I always enjoy your articles on this subject. You're enlightening us all. And just since you mentioned labels at the beginning, I really feel that one of the exciting things we're seeing at this moment, and you can see it reflected in this building right now, is that the right-left division on foreign policy is really falling away. It's no longer a useful way to figure out whether people are interventionist or non-interventionist. Recently, the Pew survey came out showing that for the first time since they've been asking this question, more than half of the respondents say that they believe, yes, America should focus more on its problems at home than trying to solve problems in other countries. And within days of that survey, in my hometown newspaper, the Boston Globe, our liberal internationalist columnist and our conservative columnist both had columns lamenting this and how awful it was that Americans were now deciding to turn away from the outside world. So that's the center consensus. And boy, you can see it in the name of this room. I've never spoken in a room with a name more hostile to my theme than the Roosevelt-Wilson room. I mean, there's your classic Republican who wants to conquer the world and spread America's influence everywhere, and your classic Democrat who wants to do the same thing. So it's great to see that this central consensus is starting to break down on both ends. Every time I come to Washington, which is as rarely as possible, I'm always struck by how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy. If you don't accept the 25 main assumptions, you're stigmatized as some kind of a wacko who can never eat lunch in this town again. That's where you get everything from neoconservatism to liberal internationalism or corporate globalism or humanitarian interventionism, responsibility to protect. These are all essentially names for the same internationalist project. Now, in my last book, as you heard, I'm trying to tell this story through a biography. So my book is a biography. It tells the story of these extraordinary brothers. On the other hand, I hope it's more than that. I'm trying to use the framework of biography to ask a larger question, which is, why does the United States behave the way that it does in the world? Why are we like this? How did we get this way? The Dulles brothers are really a great instrument for answering this question. So John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State during the 1950s, and his younger brother Allen Dulles was head of the CIA at the same time. It's the only time in history that brothers, siblings, have controlled the overt and the covert sides of American foreign policy. Now, during the 1950s, the Dulles brothers were hugely powerful. They could make and break governments, and they did. There probably was hardly a literate human being on Earth who did not know the name Dulles. But now, they've completely faded out of our historical consciousness. When I was writing this book, friends were asking me periodically, so what are you doing? What are you writing? What are you working on now? And I'd say, oh, I'm writing a book about Dulles. And they would say, the airport? As a matter of fact, when I first started working on this project, I saw on YouTube a video of President Kennedy inaugurating Dulles Airport. It was the opening ceremony. And Mrs. John Foster Dulles, the widow, is present. Allen Dulles was there. Former President Eisenhower was there, quite a distinguished little group. Kennedy made a little speech, and then he pulled the curtain aside and he revealed that big bust of John Foster Dulles that stands at the middle of Dulles Airport. But when I looked at that, I asked myself, I've been through Dulles Airport. I must have just missed that bust. But now that I'm writing about Foster Dulles, I want to go. And I planned my next trip to stop at Dulles Airport. And I asked the first security guard I met, so where's the bust? Where's the Dulles bust? And I get this blank look. Never heard of it. Finally I said, well, who do you think this airport is named after? He said, some guy named Dulles, I guess. So I thought he was just out of it, and I asked the next guy and the next guy. Anyway, the short of it is, I couldn't find the bust. Nobody ever heard of it. So I had to get on my next plane. I didn't have time to figure out what happened. But later on, through a series of emails and phone calls, I arranged to be shown the bust. At the next time I came through Dulles Airport, I was met there by a woman who works at the Metropolitan Washington Airport Authority. And she took me to see the bust of John Foster Dulles. It's in a closed conference room opposite baggage claim number 3. So from the centerpiece of the airport to a closed room at baggage claim. This really is a metaphor for what's happened to the image of the Dulles brothers. Why is it? Why did we just airbrush them out of our history? I think it's in part because their approach to the world did not work out well for us, and that therefore, rather than confront that fact and see if there are lessons that we could draw from what the Dulles brothers did, it's a lot easier just to pretend they didn't exist and forget about them and move on as if that epoch had no lessons to teach us. So the story of the Dulles brothers is very much the story of America. The forces that shaped them are the forces that have shaped our country, and particularly that shaped and continue to shape our approach to the outside world. So what were those forces? I can single out at least 3 that I think were very important in shaping the world consciousness of the Dulles brothers, the class they came from, the American foreign policy establishment, and American foreign policy. So the 2 boys grew up in Watertown, New York, a little town on the shore of Lake Ontario, which was kind of a playground for the New York rich. It was actually said to be the highest per capita income town in America at one time. Their father was the Presbyterian clergyman there, but they grew up under the influence of 2 remarkable older relatives. Their grandfather, John Watson Foster, had been Secretary of State and their uncle, Robert Lansing, was also Secretary of State. Shows you the kind of genetic background they had. And in fact, speaking of genetic background, John Watson Foster, their eminent grandfather, was the first Secretary of State ever to preside over the American overthrow of a foreign government. That was in Hawaii, 1893. So maybe there is a little genetic predisposition in the Dulles line for regime change. Every morning when the boys were kids, they would get up early, take a cold shower, which was the only kind Reverend Dulles allowed. He thought it built character. Then they would pray and sing hymns for a while. Then they were free to race down to the waterfront. And there were waiting Uncle Bert, known to us but in history as Secretary of State Lansing, and Grandfather Foster, known to us as Secretary of State John Watson Foster. And the four of them, those two older gentlemen and the two little boys, would go out on the lake every day, every summer, on fishing trips. But those weren't just fishing trips. They were a cascade of lessons in American history. John Watson Foster had lived the classic pioneer life in the age of manifest destiny. He had gone to the West and tamed the wilderness and fought the evil savages and ingratiated himself to powerful men, became influential, received diplomatic posts, and finally rose to becoming Secretary of State. He was imparting to those young boys his own experience, and it's the experience of what we would today call American exceptionalism. John Watson Foster, like the people of his generation, grew up believing that America had a providential mission, a God-given mission. America was different from other countries. America could behave differently from other countries. They believed that the United States was the apotheosis of all of human history. Everything that had ever happened in history led to the creation of our country at this moment. And therefore, we were the repository of all wisdom about how people should live. Of course, John Watson Foster thought of that idea as only applying inside North America. But his two grandsons adapted that idea for the whole world. It's really amazing when you think of how short is the curve of American history. The grandfather had campaigned for Abraham Lincoln, and the two grandsons projected American power throughout the world in the nuclear age. So this idea of American exceptionalism, that the United States had the real answer to how everybody should live and be governed, was one of the central forces that shaped the Dulles brothers. And I think it also has shaped our country and our approach to the world. Second big factor that shaped them was missionary Calvinism. They came from a long line of ministers. It wasn't just their father, it was also their grandfather and their uncles and their great-uncles and their great-grandfather. And these were not only clergymen, many of them were missionaries. So from their theological upbringing, they came away with several fundamental Calvinist principles. One is, the world is divided between the good and the evil, what's right and what's wrong. This is very different from what people in other cultures are brought up believing. Many people grow up in the world believing every individual and every government and every institution is composed of good and evil impulses, and these come out in different proportions according to different situations. The Dulles brothers did not believe this. They saw absolute good in the world, and then there was absolute evil, and there was nothing in between. So if you believe that about religion, that there's one true religion and all the other ones are false and evil, it's a very short step to believing the same thing about politics, that there's one way to rule, one political system that's good, and all the other ones are wrong and evil. And the overlay of this is the missionary instinct. It's not enough, if you're a Christian, to sit home and just hope that the heathens will find the correct way. No, you must go out and bring the truth to them. And those who most fiercely resist are by definition the ones who most desperately need your help. So that's another belief that's easily transferable from religion to politics. The Dulles brothers grew up with this idea that there were evil regimes and evil systems out there in the world, and that it was the duty of the United States to go out there and make sure those disappeared. So that was a second big force that I think shaped them. And the third, undoubtedly, was their decades of work for the biggest American multinational corporations. So the Dulles brothers spent most of their life as partners in this extraordinary Wall Street law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. And Foster Dulles became the highest paid lawyer in America because of his years as senior partner there. Now, Sullivan and Cromwell, it's called a law firm, but that's a little bit of a misleading name. If you really needed things like having a contract drawn up or you needed to be represented in a courtroom, they did have people who could do that, but that's not why people hired Sullivan and Cromwell. That firm had a specialty, and the specialty was pressuring small countries to do what big American corporations wanted them to do. That was the job of the Dulles brothers. That's how they earned their living for decades. And they were so successful at it that, without exception, every major American multinational corporation hired Sullivan and Cromwell as their lawyers. And it had an enormously successful reputation. Just to give one example, in 1917, when Foster Dulles was just a young associate, he was given a charge of a case. What had happened was there had been an election in Cuba, and the Liberal Party, which favored limiting the amount of land that foreigners could own in Cuba, won. They defeated the incumbent conservatives. And the conservatives, who were the pawns of the American sugar industry, refused to give up office. All the big American sugar companies had Sullivan and Cromwell as their lawyer. So they went to Sullivan and Cromwell and said, we got a problem in Cuba. You got to fix that. You got to get rid of that liberal rebellion so that our conservatives can stay in power. Foster Dulles got the case. He immediately got on the train in Penn Station. He came to Washington. He went to see Uncle Bert, otherwise known as Secretary of State Lansing. And Uncle Bert asked him, what do you think we should do? And Foster Dulles said we should send 2 warships to Cuba and put down that liberal rebellion. The next day, 2 American warships were sent to Cuba. 6,000 Marines debarked. They put down the liberal rebellion. They began a 5-year occupation of Cuba. And everything turned out fine in the end. If the end is only in the next 5 years. If you look a few decades further, things didn't quite work out so well in Cuba. But that's an example of the kind of work the Dulles brothers did all their lives. So they came to see the interests of American multinational corporations and the interests of the United States as being identical. Now, at the end of their period as private lawyers, so in the very early 1950s, before they went into the Eisenhower administration, the Dulles brothers suffered 2 most unaccustomed reverses. First one happened in Iran. The Iranian government, with the unanimous vote of parliament, voted to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. That industry was owned by one British company, and the bank, the financial agent for that company, was something called Schroeder Bank, a big international banking house, and Schroeder Bank was a client of Sullivan and Cromwell. And in fact, Allen Dulles was on the board of directors of Schroeder Bank. So he essentially had to go back to his friends who he'd worked with so long and say, we failed you in Iran. You hired us to protect your interests in Iran, and you just lost them. Very soon afterward, something similar happened in Guatemala. Guatemalan Congress passed a land reform act that affected the interests of one of the biggest Sullivan and Cromwell clients, United Fruit. And by the way, United Fruit's bank was also the Schroeder Bank, by coincidence. So the Dulles brothers had to go to United Fruit, with which they'd worked very intimately over many years, and say, you just lost your interests in Guatemala, or your interests are being affected negatively, and we couldn't protect you. As private lawyers, there wasn't much they could do, but the moment they got into office, they began plotting against Mossadegh. They didn't even wait to be sworn in before they started the planning to overthrow the government of Iran. That was accomplished that summer, and the day it was done, they immediately started thinking about going after that guy in Guatemala. So they had carried their grudges against these 2 democratic leaders, Mossadegh in Iran and Arbenz in Guatemala, with them from their days as private lawyers into these positions of tremendous power that they exercised in the 1950s. It shows you how the corporate interest bleeds into foreign policy making and that's again a process still very real today. So I think these are three forces that did shape the Dulles brothers and their world and our world. It's American exceptionalism, missionary Calvinism, and corporate globalism. Interestingly enough, although the Dulles brothers were ideologically and politically identical, they saw the world in exactly the same way, and this was very dangerous because they never consulted anyone else about the countries where they were intervening. In their personal lives, in their private personalities, they were polar opposites. So John Foster Dulles was stiff, arrogant, dour, self-righteous, combative. Winston Churchill once said, "He's the only bull I know who carries his own china shop around with him." But I actually like the line even better from another British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, about Foster Dulles. He said, "His speech was slow, but it easily kept pace with his thoughts." Allen Dulles, on the other hand, was a sparkling conversationalist and a wine connoisseur and a tennis player. He had 100 affairs with everybody from Claire Booth Luce to the Queen of Greece. He was a prized dinner guest at Georgetown parties. And I think this is important because Allen Dulles was not just the head of the invisible government. He was also the ambassador of the invisible government to the visible government. And I think after those Georgetown parties, a lot of people went home and said to themselves, well, we don't know what the CIA is. We don't know what it does. But if it's run by such a wonderful guy like Allen, how bad can it be? That's part of what allowed such leeway for the Dulles operations. Now, once in office, the Dulles brothers lashed out against real and imagined enemies around the world. One of the themes of my book is that we've misunderstood the history of the 1950s. We think of it as a time of peace, tense peace. But in fact, the Dulles brothers led the United States into an unbroken world war during the 1950s. We didn't see it. Americans didn't see it because it was waged mainly covertly and clandestinely. And at times when it did break out into public view, as it did in Guatemala or in Indonesia, where the Dulles brothers fomented a civil war, Americans were told that this was just a local uprising. In fact, that's the way the two brothers worked. Foster, in public, would get up and make speeches about how the leaders of country X were becoming too left-wing, too pro-Soviet, insufficiently pro-American. Then Allen would secretly work to foment upheaval and trouble in that country. And then Foster would make speeches saying how gratifying it was to see that the patriotic people of that nation on their own were rising up against their evil masters. In this way, they function kind of like two jaws of a serpent. They're not really connected organically, but always working in tandem. So the theater of operations of this global war kept changing. It's another reason why it was hard to follow. From Iran to Guatemala, to Indonesia, to Egypt, to the Congo, to Cuba. But the people in those countries, of course, were very aware of what was happening to them. And when you look back at the roots of the world crises that exploded over the next 50 years, including some that are still shaking the world, you can trace so much of it back to the era of the Dulles brothers. Iran just being one example. Vietnam is another. John Foster Dulles is more responsible for American involvement in Vietnam than any other single individual. He was the head of the U.S. delegation to the Geneva Peace Conference in 1954, at which the future of Indochina was going to be decided. He had only been there a couple of days before it became clear to him that this conference was ultimately, as a result of Ho Chi Minh's victory at Dien Bien Phu, going to give Ho Chi Minh control over at least a sliver of Indochina. Foster Dulles found this intolerable, so he left. It's the only time in history that an American Secretary of State has abandoned a major foreign conference in the middle. And his idea was, of course, the French cannot defeat Ho Chi Minh and the decadent British can't do it, but we, our exceptional nation, can do it. As soon as he got home, he told his brother, I want you to go to Vietnam, and I want you to start a project to fight Ho Chi Minh. If that one guy, Foster Dulles, had not made that one decision on that one day while flying home from Geneva, we might have avoided the entire American involvement in Vietnam. And it's hard even to wrap your mind around how different America and Vietnam and the world would be under those circumstances. So looking back over the Dulles brothers, what lessons can we learn from them? These are the lessons that I think we're shying away from. The Dulles brothers made some historic misjudgments. The first one was they were very caught in the paradigm of conflict and confrontation. They were completely against any negotiations or summits or meetings or discussions between the United States and its enemies or rivals. Their idea was never negotiate, never talk, and in the end you'll get what you want. That's why they opposed all contacts with the Soviets. It was Foster Dulles' idea that if Americans were to sit across the table from Soviet diplomats, and pictures of this would be distributed to Americans, and a negotiating process would begin, it would then seem to Americans as if the Soviets were rational human beings. They might have some ideas. They might listen to our ideas. We would talk, and we would see what we could come up with. And Foster Dulles thought that would just destroy the paradigm of conflict on which national unity was based. So in 1950, so they had only been in office a few weeks, really, when Stalin died at the beginning of 1953. Soon afterwards, the West began getting peace feelers from the Kremlin. And at the end of 1953, there was a summit meeting in Bermuda of what was called then the Big Three, which was France, Britain, and United States. And one of the agenda items was a request from the interim Kremlin leader, Malenkov, to have another summit that would be, as he called it, the Big Four. So France, Britain, United States, and Soviet Union. Churchill, who was there, thought this was a great idea. The French were for it. But Foster Dulles was totally against it. That summit was never held. He vetoed it. So by his policies, he could easily have lengthened and intensified the Cold War in very profound ways. Second huge misjudgment that the Dulles brothers made is that they completely misunderstood the nature of third world nationalism. This was a period, of course, the early 1950s, when new nations were emerging from all sorts of different kinds of colonialism and looking for their place in a turbulent world. Many of them were backward and underdeveloped, and they focused their attention inward. As far as world politics were concerned, they wanted to be neutrals. That's why you had the emergence of this ideology called neutralism. It was third world developing countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America who were not pro-Soviet and not pro-Washington. They just wanted to develop their own countries. Foster Dulles hated neutralism. He thought it was worse than Bolshevism. He never could believe that newly emerging countries could produce truly patriotic leaders who were not interested in the global struggle. He thought that all those leaders were actually tools of the Kremlin. I'm talking about people like Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Sukarno in Indonesia, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Nasser in Egypt. It was Foster Dulles' idea that the Kremlin, as it looked around the world, had realized that there were some countries where it couldn't take power right away, couldn't drag them under communist rule. So while we were waiting for the right moment, the best thing would be to place one of our lackeys in power in that country who would not reveal himself as a Kremlin agent, but would pretend to be a neutralist, and then at the appropriate moment, after having subverted all the country's institutions, he would unveil himself as a pro-Soviet communist, and then the country would immediately be brought behind the Iron Curtain. So this is the way that he saw people like Lumumba and Nasser and Sukarno. He had no understanding of the desire of people in poor countries to control their own resources and their own destinies. And in fact, he had spent his entire legal career crushing those aspirations. He did that also in office. So that was a second huge misjudgment, and it turned the leaders and the people of many Latin American and African and Asian nations against the United States, despite the fact that their principles and their ideals are very much in concert with our central ideals. The third huge misjudgment that the Dulles brothers made was they had no concept of what we now call blowback. Eisenhower was the same way. Eisenhower was a great supporter of covert action. He saw it, I think, as a kind of a peace project. You wouldn't have to invade countries. It was very simple and cheap, and there wouldn't be any long-term effects. Iran was a great example. So we woke up one morning and everything seemed perfect. We got rid of a guy we didn't like, Mossadegh, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we wanted. Seemed like the ideal outcome. Doesn't seem so ideal from the perspective of today. But the Dulles brothers and Eisenhower did not have the imagination to think of what might be the long-term results of their interventions. And actually, here's one misjudgment for which I think they might have an excuse. If the Dulles brothers were standing here today, they might say, well, we didn't know that covert interventions and secret operations to overthrow foreign governments could have huge consequences 50 years later, because 50 years before we were in power, there were no covert operations. But we don't have that excuse today. We can at least build on their experience and learn the lesson of blowback. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I finally found that John Foster Dulles bust. None of you will ever be able to see it, but I'm telling you, you're not missing anything from an artistic standpoint. It's not a great work of art. Mrs. Dulles paid for it. I'm not sure she hired the greatest American sculptor. He looks kind of bug-eyed and not very appealing. Nonetheless, there is one of the great works of political art of the 20th century that does feature the Dulles brothers right in the middle. It's a 16-foot-long mural by the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera on linen. It's called Glorious Victory. It depicts the overthrow of the government of Guatemala by the Dulles brothers in 1954. So the story is that after that overthrow, there was a wave of outrage in Latin America. There were many protests, and American flags were burned in every country in Latin America. And that happened in Mexico. At that time, Frida Kahlo, the wife of Diego Rivera, was quite ill and under doctor's orders not to leave the house. She was so outraged by what had happened in Guatemala that she told Diego Rivera, we're going to go. We're going to go march in the protest. And you can actually find a photo of Diego Rivera pushing the wheelchair with Frida Kahlo wrapped up in blankets at the front of that protest demonstration. Frida Kahlo died 11 days later. That was her last appearance in public. And Diego Rivera went on to paint this magnificent mural, Glorious Victory. I reproduce it in one of the plates in a small black and white version in my book. So the mural shows Foster Dulles and Alan. Foster Dulles right in the middle with a big grin on his face, shaking hands with this Guatemalan lackey he has just placed in power as the new dictator. And Alan Dulles is right behind him, holding a satchel from which piles of money are spilling out. In front of them is a big unexploded bomb with the smiling face of Eisenhower painted on it. And there are Guatemalan laborers bending under the weight of heavy banana stems that they're carrying up to a freighter with an American flag on it. Dead Guatemalan children are to be seen on the ground. So I've stared at this picture on the internet, on reproductions, for hours. I think I know every square inch of it. It's a fascinating piece of work. And when I was finishing my book, I decided I want to go see it. I actually want to commune with it. So I was making a trip to Mexico on a vacation, and I called one of the Diego Rivera foundations in Mexico while I was there, and I said, I want to see this picture. But I also got a kind of a puzzled response. Nobody seemed to know exactly what I meant or where it was, and again, I was too rushed. I didn't have time. I actually had to wind up hiring someone in Mexico to track down this spectacular mural. And so here's the story. Here's what they found out. So this mural, Diego Rivera was a communist. He donated his mural to the people of the Soviet Union. But the Soviets did not like Diego Rivera because he was changing his mind every day and he wasn't dogmatic enough or doctrinaire, not to mention that Trotsky was his house guest. So the picture just disappeared. And it wasn't until the 1990s that a group of Mexican art historians decided to take this on as a project. Let's find it. Let's figure out what happened to this masterpiece. And sure enough, they discovered that it's now owned by the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. So I had to ask myself, am I really willing to fly to Moscow for 1 hour just to stand in front of this picture? And after a few days of thought, I thought, yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to Moscow. So I wrote to make arrangements with the Pushkin Museum, and after some back and forth, I finally located the deputy director who sent me this note. It said, the picture you want to see, Glorious Victory, is rolled up on a roll in one of our storage basements. If you come to Moscow, I can take you to the basement to see the roll, but I cannot unroll it for you because we have no room. So what it means is that this masterpiece, which is so full of meaning for us, is essentially lost. I mean, it's not disappeared, but it might as well be. There's no plan ever to show it again, and it will just sit there and sit there. So that brings me to my modest proposal. So my idea is we should try to liberate that picture from the basement of the Pushkin Museum. The people who need to see it are not in Russia. And they're not in Guatemala either, because the people in Guatemala are fully aware of what happened to them. The people who need to see it are us. And I have the ideal place for it. I think it should become the centerpiece of Dulles Airport. Let us put that there with the bust in front. They wouldn't have to sell copies of my book. Either way would be fine. But maybe we could put some plaques in front of the picture that would tell us a little about the Dulles brothers, explain who they were and what they did, and raise some questions that, if we would focus on and try to answer, might not only help us to understand their era, but might also help us today to create a more just and a more peaceful world. Thank you. Thanks. Well, I'm glad Roosevelt and Wilson aren't around to hear that, but any of the rest of you have questions, please come to the microphone.
Oh, sorry about that. Is this on? Hello. Okay. The idea of American exceptionalism was loomed large in your talk, and I wonder. I've certainly heard about it a lot and pondered about it. Do you happen to know its origin?
I would place its origin at the very beginning of European settlement in America. When John Winthrop came to Boston, he made that famous statement, "We shall be as a city upon a hill, and the eyes of all people are upon us." Now, what he meant by that, as he explained in other writings, was we're going to build the best country that we can. And if other people see things they like, maybe we can be an example for them. But somewhere along the way, over the next 150 years, that city on a hill idea began to change. And it changed from the idea that we should just be an example to the idea that we should go out in the world and make people be like us. It was always part of the European settlement idea in America that the United States had been providentially chosen. It was a second Israel, as it was sometimes called. And it was the place that had been ordained to show the rest of the world the right way to do things. I think it was an integral part of the self-image of America as we were expanding within the United States. Manifest destiny became a term in the 1840s, and it has remained that way to this day.
Any names of people who might have helped advance that metamorphosis of that idea?
Certainly, if you're talking about inside the United States, you can see that those who launched the Mexican War would have been great believers in that. James K. Polk, the Napoleon of the stump, he would certainly be one of them. And I also feel that as America expanded abroad for economic reasons, to take pressure off, because we were overproducing in grain, we were overproducing in manufactured goods, we needed foreign markets. I think there was always a need, and there still is, for something, some ideology, some explanation to clothe this. You can't, we're not like the French that openly say we're just doing it for business. We're a little more like children. We need a kind of a fairy tale to explain to us why we do these things. And Americans, alone among the big countries, I think, have this idea, we are not selfish. Other countries intervene in the world for greedy motives, but we're not like that. In fact, the opposite is true. We sacrifice ourselves in order to help bring up other countries. So I think every generation has their guilty parties.
Hi, yes. I was wondering about the Dulles brothers' involvement and activity during the time of the Suez Canal crisis and what kind of their activity was during.
Yes, the Dulles brothers were quite involved during the Suez crisis. As you recall, of course, the French and the British and the Israelis launched an invasion of Egypt, and finally that invasion was rolled back with the support of the United States. I think there were a couple of reasons for this. The most important one was that the Americans understood themselves as taking over the imperial role in the Middle East. This was the time when the British were leaving. The British weren't really aware they were leaving, but we wanted to be sure they were leaving. Same thing with the French. We saw this as the beginning of the era of American dominance in the Middle East. And suddenly the French and the British were trying to assert themselves again. Interestingly enough, this was at a time when the Dulles brothers were trying to overthrow Nasser in Egypt, another neutralist. But he became so popular as the hero of Suez that they had to give up that plan. And in fact, it was soon after that that Nasser turned to the Soviets and brought not just Soviet aid, but Soviet military into Egypt with hundreds of MiG fighters in a massive presence. So what it means is that the Soviet presence in the Middle East, which the Dulles brothers were always terrified might happen, did not begin as the result of the decline or the decay or the overthrow of an existing system. It came at the overt public invitation of a highly popular leader, and the Dulles brothers made all that possible.
Mr. Kinzer, thank you for keeping history alive. I really appreciate your work. Two quick questions. One, we know the Dulles brothers. If there's one man that can sponsor a coup successfully, it is Allen Dulles. One quick question. If we took Dulles out of the equation, do you think today the United States would still be sponsoring all these coups, supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, and whatnot? Do you think we would have all these foreign entanglements, overthrowing governments today if the Dulles brothers were not part of the equation?
I think that the Dulles brothers represented a class, and there was a desire to do this. On the other hand, Allen Dulles came from this kind of silver spoon background of these spoiled boys who came back from the Second World War, like the British pilots at the Battle of Britain, and they had to go home and be milkmen again. They weren't happy. They wanted action. And it was Allen Dulles, from his background as a rich kid on Long Island, who felt, I want to be out there. I didn't start the CIA and join it in order to observe and reflect and analyze. I did it to go out in the world and crush the evil. So I think we might not have struck out against governments like the one in Iran had it not been for the deep, particular personal backgrounds of the Dulles brothers.
And then one other quick question. After the 1961 failed Bay of Pigs debacle, Kennedy was quoted as saying he wanted to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the wind. We know Dulles and Kennedy butted heads. Kennedy obviously had back channels with Khrushchev. Do you think that knowing Allen Dulles, he could have been responsible in some type of way for the assassination and murder of JFK?
Of course, Allen Dulles was fired after the Bay of Pigs invasion, and Kennedy had a great line for him. Kennedy called him in and said, in a parliamentary system, I would now be resigning. But under our system, it is you who must go. So he fired Allen Dulles, and then 2 years later, after Kennedy's assassination, Allen Dulles wound up on the Warren Commission. Here's what I think his role was. I'm old enough to remember that it was clear, even when the Warren Commission was founded, that it was founded with the specific goal of coming to the conclusion that it was one crazy guy that did this thing. So Allen Dulles had two roles. Johnson told him to go onto the commission and make sure that the Warren Commission never found out that the CIA had been trying to kill leaders in the Caribbean like Castro, because he feared that this would lead them off into other areas of investigation. So it was Allen's job to cover that up and be sure that nothing the CIA had ever done came to the attention of the Warren Commission. And he did this in two ways. He briefed the Warren Commission investigators and members how to ask questions to the CIA witnesses, what questions to ask. And then he would brief the CIA witnesses before they came in and tell them what kinds of questions they were going to be asked and how they should answer. So actually, he succeeded brilliantly in his assignment to help cover up the reality and lead the Warren Commission off to in the direction that it finally went. I think we finally reached the end of the public session. There's a couple of people who still want to talk. I'd be happy to do it afterwards, but I've been told we have to be very strict here. And I just want to conclude by thanking the Friends of Freedom Foundation and all of the people who are trying to break us out of this paradigm that has made us so interventionist and caused such terrible results, not only for target countries, but also for the security of the United States. Thank you.